18, I found my mother's handwriting in an English church record. She said she had never left home. My mother had the most particular handwriting I had ever seen. She pressed hard on every downstroke, as though the pen needed to be reminded who was in charge. Her capital letters leaned slightly to the left, against the direction most people write. The and her lowercase e closed at the top in a way that looked almost like a number 9. I know this because I watched her write grocery lists, copy scripture, and sign her name to church documents for the first 31 years of my life. I would have recognized that handwriting in a burning room. I was 34 years old when I saw it inside an English church record in a county I had never heard of, in a state she claimed she had never visited. In a year she would have been 19. Her name, her full birth name, not the shortened version she used at home, was written on a membership line beside the name of a congregation that was not Amish, not Mennonite, not anything close to what she had always told me she came from. Beneath her name was a date, beneath the date was a roll, and beneath the roll was a second signature, written in the same hand, on a document confirming her as a baptized, active, contributing member of a Protestant church in the English world. My mother, who told me she had been born plain and had never once left it. I stood in a library research room with fluorescent lights humming above me, and a laminated visitor badge clipped to my dress, and I did not cry. I did not feel righteous or triumphant. I felt the way you feel when a floor you have trusted your entire life shifts slightly beneath your feet. Not collapsing, just informing you, quietly and without apology, that it was never as solid as you believed. This is the story of how I got to that room. It is also the story of what I found after I left it. I grew up in a small Amish district in eastern Ohio. My father's family had farmed the same land for 4 generations. My mother arrived in the district when she was 22 years old, introduced through a cousin connection that was never explained in much detail. Story I was given, the one I accepted without real question until I was well into adulthood, was simple. My mother had been raised in a plain community in another state. Her parents had both died before she turned 20, and she had come to Ohio to start fresh among people who shared her faith. That story had the quality of something that had been handled many times. Smooth at the edges, easy to hold. She was a devoted wife and a careful mother. She kept an orderly home. She did not complain in front of the children. In the community where I grew up, those qualities were respected above almost everything else, and my mother had them in a way that felt almost studied, as though she had decided precisely who she intended to be, and had not wavered from that decision since. There were small things I noticed over the years that did not quite fit. A child notices things she does not yet have language for. My mother never spoke Pennsylvania Dutch with the ease that everyone else's mothers did. When she used it, the words came out measured, like a person reciting from memory rather than thinking in a language. My father's family accepted this without comment. She had come from a different district, they said, and dialects varied. I accepted it too for many years. She also did not have a single photograph, letter, or object from before her marriage. Every family in our district had something: a tin box with an old Bible, a grandmother's prayer covering folded in tissue paper, a brother's name written on the inside cover of a hymn book. My mother had nothing. When I asked her once, around age 9 or 10, she told me that her parents' house had flooded the winter after they died, and everything was ruined. I believed her. It was a reasonable answer. I filed it away and forgot it for 20 years. The thing that started the unraveling was not dramatic. It was a genealogy project. I was 31 years old, recently widowed, with 2 children and more quiet evenings than I knew how to fill. A woman in my district had begun tracing her family line and had encouraged several of us to do the same. In our community, the oral history carried most of what mattered, but she had found a service that could access older records. And she was enthusiastic in the way people become when a hobby surprises them with depth. I began with my father's side, which was straightforward and well documented. 4 generations of Ohio farmers all accounted for. Then I turned to my mother. I had her full birth name. I had the state she claimed to be from. I had the approximate years of her parents' lives based on what she had told me. I submitted a search and waited. The first result came back within 2 weeks, and it stopped me completely. There was no record of my mother's parents dying in the county she had named. There was no record of them living there either. The names she had given me, her father's name, her mother's name, the surname she carried into her marriage, appeared nowhere in the church records. the land records or district directories for that community during the years she had described. I told myself the records were incomplete. Rural communities from that era were often poorly documented. I found other explanations. I set the project aside for nearly a month. But I did not forget it. The second contradiction arrived through a woman named Ruth, who had grown up in a community 2 districts over and had known my mother slightly in the years just before my mother's marriage. I met Ruth at a quilting gathering, and when I mentioned my mother's name, Ruth's expression shifted in a way I had learned, by then, to pay attention to. She said she remembered my mother. She said my mother had arrived in the area not from the state she usually named, but from somewhere further east. She said this casually, as though correcting a minor geographical error, and then moved on to a different subject. I did not move on. That evening I wrote down what Ruth had said and held it beside what I already knew. My mother's Dutch, the missing records, the absent photographs, the story that had always been smooth at the edges. I sat with these things for a long time. My revised understanding was still charitable. Perhaps my mother had moved between communities before settling. Perhaps the state she named was where she had lived last, not where she had been born. People simplified their histories. This was not unusual, and it was not necessarily dishonest. I believed this revised explanation for almost a year. Then I found the letters. My mother was still living. She was 71 years old and had moved into a smaller house after my father's death, and I helped her settle into it. While moving a cedar chest that had sat in a corner of her bedroom for as long as I could remember, the bottom panel shifted, and a thin bundle of papers slid out from beneath it. They were not letters in the traditional sense. They were more like the beginning of letters. 3 pieces of paper, each with a few lines written and then stopped, as though the writer had started and then reconsidered. The handwriting was my mother's, unmistakably. The pressing downstrokes, the leftward lean, the closed lowercase e. But the language was not Pennsylvania Dutch. It was standard English, written in the informal, unguarded way people write when they are not performing. And one of the fragments included a phrase I could not explain, a reference to a Sunday morning service, and the name of a congregation that meant nothing to me. I folded the papers and placed them in my apron pocket. My mother was in the kitchen. I listened to her moving around, the familiar sounds of her occupying a space, and I felt something I had never felt toward her before. Not anger, not grief, something more like vertigo. I did not confront her. Not then. I needed to know more before I was willing to risk what a confrontation might close. It took me 6 months to trace the congregation name from those fragments to a physical location. It was a Protestant church in a county in Pennsylvania, active from the 1960s through the early 2000s, when it had merged with a larger congregation. The merged congregation maintained archived records. They were not digitized. To access them, I would need to visit in person. I told my children I was visiting a friend. I told my bishop I had a family matter to attend to. Neither statement was entirely false. I drove 3 hours east in a borrowed car, wearing my plain dress and my cap, and I sat in a church office while a kind, elderly volunteer pulled out a leather binder and opened it across a table. The membership rolls from 1971 to 1984 were handwritten in a careful administrative script, except for 3 pages where a different hand had filled, in names when the regular recorder had apparently been absent. On the second of those pages, in the year my mother would have been 19 years old, her full birth name appeared on a new member list. The handwriting was hers. I would have recognized it in a burning room. Beside her name was a date of baptism, not Amish baptism, not any plain tradition but a standard Protestant ceremony. Beside the date was her listed role, junior choir, and at the bottom of the page a second entry in the same hand, this one a signature confirming attendance at a congregational vote. My mother had not only attended this church, she had been a member. She had been baptized there. She had sung in the choir. She had voted in church business meetings. She had been, by every available record, a fully participating member of an English Protestant congregation for at least 3 years before she appeared in Ohio as a plain woman who had been raised plain her entire life. I sat in that office for a long time after the volunteer excused herself. The fluorescent light hummed. My visitor badge pressed against my dress. Outside the window, an ordinary parking lot held ordinary cars, and none of it seemed to have any particular relationship to the world I had grown up inside. I drove home understanding that I had been living beside a secret my entire life without ever being invited into it. The question that occupied me for the following weeks was not angry. It was the question of a person who has finally stopped accepting an explanation and needs to understand the real one. Why had she come? Why had she left that life, entered a plain community, built such a careful and deliberate identity, and never once allowed the earlier version of herself to be visible? I thought about the woman Ruth had known, a woman who had arrived already formed, already certain of who she intended to be. I thought about the studied quality of my mother's discipline, the way her virtues had always felt chosen rather than inherited. I thought about the handwriting pressed hard on every downstroke, as though the pen needed to be reminded who was in charge. I thought about a 19-year-old girl singing in a choir somewhere in Pennsylvania, and I tried to imagine what had happened to make her decide, a few years later, to disappear entirely into a different life. I asked her directly on a Thursday afternoon in November. I had brought the photocopy the volunteer had made for me. I set it on the table between us without speaking. My mother looked at it for a long time. She did not ask what it was. She did not say she had never seen it before. She folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window instead. And I understood that whatever answer she was going to give me, she had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. What she told me was this: she had grown up in a non-religious family, not irreligious, simply indifferent. When she was 17, a friend had brought her to that Protestant congregation, and she had found, in the music and the community and the rhythm of Sunday mornings, something she had not known she was looking for. She had been baptized at 19, she had been happy. Then she had met a young man who was not from her world, who was not interested in remaining in it, who had made her promises in the language of permanence that did not hold. When that ended at 21, she said, the congregation felt like a building that belonged to someone else. She could not return to it without the version of herself she had taken there. A cousin, a distant one, not someone she remained close to, had mentioned a plain community in Ohio. My mother had gone to see it with no particular intention. What she found was structure, clarity, a way of living that made every decision smaller and therefore easier. She had asked to be received. The community had accepted her. She had learned the language, the customs, and the calendar. She had built herself into someone the community recognized as one of their own. She had never lied about her parents. Her parents had died. The other details, the community of origin, the timeline, the seamless history she had presented, those were the shape she had given to a silence. She had not believed, she said, that the truth would be welcomed, and after enough years the silence had simply become the story. "Did you ever want to tell me?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Every time you asked about your grandparents," she said. "Every time you looked like you wanted something to hold on to." The kettle on her stove began to whistle. Neither of us moved to take it off. I have spent the years since that conversation separating three things that used to sit together in one undivided space inside me. The first is what actually happened. A young woman made a life, lost it in the way young people lose things, and built a different one with the materials available to her. She was not a villain. She was not performing an elaborate deception out of malice. She was a person who had decided, at 22, that the easiest way to carry her grief was to leave it in a place where no one could find it and never go back. The second is what I was told. Not by my mother alone, by the whole architecture of assumption that surrounds a person when she grows up inside a community with clear borders. I was told without words that people who are fully plain have always been plain. I was told that origins are clean and legible and stable. I was told that the story I had been handed was the same as the truth. These are not unusual things to be told, they are simply not always accurate. The third is what I choose to believe about myself. And this is the part I did not expect to need to decide. Because when the story about your mother changes, the story about you changes with it. The ground shifts, and for a time you stand in the space where two versions of your history overlap, and you are not sure which parts of yourself belong to which version. What I believe now is this: I am my mother's daughter in the way that matters most. Not because of what community she came from, or what registry her name appeared in, but because she pressed hard on every downstroke, because she built things carefully and held them, because when her world broke apart, she found another one and learned to live inside it with full commitment. I recognize those qualities. I have needed them myself. I still have the photocopy from the church office. I keep it inside a cedar chest, which strikes me on occasion as something worth noticing. My mother's name in her own handwriting, from a year before I existed, in a life that became mine without my knowing. I don't keep it as evidence. I keep it because it is the most honest thing she ever wrote, and she wrote it before she knew she was going to need to be anyone other than herself.